Aloha. In collapse, what matters? Really, we're talking about fundamentals here. And this is the crux of this particular episode. How do we get down to the basics? What matters? Aloha, welcome back. This is the Horizon Story podcast. And, we're talking about what is it that when things are not working, that we have to pay attention to in particular? How do we know what we should do and how do we know when should we do it? And this is where we have to actually look at everything as a whole rather than policy issues or policy questions or even what any particular political party or legislative body might say. We should have our eyes wide open. Maka'ala. Take a look and see what is happening. Where are the needs? It's important for us to know that. Where the needs are the greatest is where we should pay attention, where we should figure out. If we're advocating for things that the government provides or that policy would solve, then that's where we should look. If we're looking at how we might supplement that which government or programs or institutions are no longer able to figure out for us, then that's where we should begin with the fundamentals. So let's talk about some of the fundamentals. It's really not surprising that we might begin with food. Okay. Food is so fundamental in terms of human life, or all life for that matter. Right? All animals, all beings, all plant life require some aspect of food in order to just survive on a daily basis. So when we say that we're entering a period in which that cannot be guaranteed, even in one of the richest countries in the world, one of the most resourced countries in the world, then we really do have to pay attention. It would be an indicator. It would be a sign. Right now, there are about 13.7% of the U.S. population, or 18 million households, that would be getting some kind of food assistance. And part of the strain right now is it's going in both directions, which is that we are reevaluating how it is that you qualify for all of this. And it's coming into a different kind of debate than one might normally talk about, just here's the need and here's what we must do. Without getting into that complication, it's important for us to mark that within about 18 to 24 months, we're likely to get to about 25% of the population of this country who will be in need of some kind of food support. That's 85 million people who live near you who are going to need some kind of food support. Now, these numbers come to us from various sources, but not the government per se, because the annual hunger study has been canceled. And so I'm not going to go down the road as to why that is so or who made the decision. It's just that that particular study is no longer being done within this country at the moment. But the numbers from various sources bring us close to the 25%. This number is also reinforced by the two things. One is income inequality, and the other is the rising cost of all things, including food. So if you are a meat eater, beef costs have been on the rise for some time. Some of that by government decisions, but also because drought conditions within the country have made it more expensive in order for there to be high producing cattle, and have indeed made the current livestock essentially not don't grow. They just don't grow as fast. And so if they don't grow as fast, then there isn't as much meat as there used to be. There's also the complicating factor of political decisions that have been made about what happens with programs like SNAP, which is the nutritional assistance program that we've had within this country. The good news with food is that this country has enough food to feed everybody. It just needs to be redistributed. And so the redistribution of that food becomes the task. As the people in Maine, in the story that I told in an earlier episode, understood when they fed folks that were in their town and the surrounding areas, for 25 days, right? Dinners 6 nights a week, 5,300 meals, was really about the redistribution of food and doing that in community in ways in which the food would sustain more than just our appetites. So we have food, we have shelter. Affordability is the word of the year. It may be the word of 2 or 3 years, as it turns out. Now, we in Hawaii have long had an affordability problem with housing. That's because we have a limited amount of land, and we have a limited amount of land that is good to build things on. So a limited of the limited, and everything has to be shipped in. So every single nail, every single board of, in terms of wood, for all of the things, that you would put into a house have to be brought in. So you put the two together, and we've long had an affordability problem with housing. But there was something that happened within the country as a whole, that before the pandemic, you would hear housing talked about in some places, but not in all places. And today, affordability of shelter is an issue everywhere in this country. And it's relative. For some places, the fact that the average cost has gone up, the median cost has gone up to, say, $250,000 is like astronomical. Whereas in Hawaii, if you talk about $250,000, they would wonder if it's one of those houses where the termites are holding hands. So it's all relative to the place. Nonetheless, what it means is that people are spending far more than 30% of their household income for shelter. And that is the threshold, right? So there are actually 1 in 6 households that are spending more than 50% of their household income on shelter. And that's 20 million households within the country. So affordability. If shelter is expensive, it tends to mean that you have to actually put off decisions. You may rent rather than purchase. You may rent with multiple people, which, by the way, in Hawaii, we've long done. We can tell you a little bit about how to do that. But it also means that if both food and shelter are expensive, you're going to be making choices between the two. Let's take power. In most places in the country, electricity is how it is that you generate power for all the things of modernity. And right now, the cost of electricity is outpacing inflation. That's always bad news in terms of the outlay that any household is spending for that. Now, in my house, we actually are not big electrical users. And so the number, how much we pay, even though it's the highest rate in the nation, that the size of that electrical costs as part of our monthly costs is not high. In fact, it's so not high that I don't expend enough on a monthly basis to be able to amortize solar panels, for example. And that's a shame, because as much as we can, everyone should try to make the push to other sources of electricity. But it literally would not make sense for me financially for me to do that as a single household. Electrical costs right now are also beginning to feel the push of what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz. So oil, as it is, becomes a short supply in different places in the world, begins to impact every other place in the world. So the fact that the United States of America mostly gets our fuel for things like electricity on a domestic basis does not mean that we are therefore sheltered from the increases in costs of fuel across the globe. Electricity is also becoming a factor in the AI debate. Okay, electricity and water. So, artificial intelligence cannot happen without these huge industrial complexes called data centers, which are essentially tricked out warehouses that consume enormous amounts of electricity and enormous amounts of water, because as the data center is churning and just examining like all the data of the world all the time, that what happens is that the equipment heats up. And they haven't been able to resolve that in a way that would not involve water. Water that would serve as a cooling system to keep all of that equipment from heating up. Let's just give you a sense of how hot the equipment gets. With the water being used to cool the systems so that they are still operating, it will still increase the temperature of the ground by 10 degrees. Think about that. That's how much heat, that's how much electricity has to be used. So everywhere in the country where data centers have come up, and oh, by the way, in other countries other than the United States, that the enormous amounts of electricity, the enormous amounts of water place the communities that surround those data centers at risk for higher costs and actually less reliability. And it's less reliability because the systems would put a premium on making sure that the data centers never crash. Okay? So therefore, when there are different loads on the system, the data centers, those corporate warehouses that generate all of that data that, we ask the question of. So how many bananas are there in the Dominican Republic? If we ask a question like that and AI is generating the answer, you're using a minimum of 2 liters of water on just that answer. And you're raising the cost of electricity for the various data centers that are generating that answer. It is a huge industrial question. We think of it as about high technology, but we should also understand the high technology of today is a huge industrial operation. And then, of course, there is healthcare. Healthcare is both more expensive and less accessible. 4 to 7 million people will lose their insurance as part of what occurred in the One Big Beautiful Bill. There's money that is saved by some people will mean that other people will be on their own. That's just how it goes. That's just how it goes. So the question is, how will that balance out or not? What happens when 4 to 7 million people lose their insurance? If they don't access the healthcare system on a regular basis, which is what happens when people lose their insurance, then chronic conditions and acute conditions arise without being prevented at the earlier part of whatever that condition happens to be. And the earlier preventive or intervention types of care is actually the most efficient, least expensive kind of care. So we are trading both the future and the present by believing that we can go through society essentially and just not manage the care that people are able to get. Okay. 1/3 of the Medicaid folks have been disenrolled already. Okay. And that puts more pressure on the system. So if you don't have your healthcare coverage and the food is becoming more expensive and the housing is more expensive and the water is more expensive, well, you can see how that goes. Okay. One-third of the world will be at risk for potable water by 2032. Okay. Now, much of that is not in this country, but here's the thing that happens when people lose their potable water. What happens is that life in that area becomes much more difficult. And when life in that area becomes more difficult, they are more prone to thinking about, moving. They're prone to think about moving. And so it's like the drought that occurs far, far away from a country like America or Canada or France or Germany, that drought affects us too, because people will need to seek out of just pure survival, live in other places. And so they will take up migration. Okay. You'd say, migration is a choice. Well, sometimes it is a desperate choice. And so therefore, water, right, becomes a very critical thing. How do we keep our water not only pure and clean, but also available? How do we put up guardrails to make sure that it's not only the drought that is using up the water? Okay. In Europe, there is a whole move now. You could say it's a movement in of itself to take down the dams. And the reason why they're looking at taking down the dams is because the dams, the DAMS, the dams no longer produce as much electricity because the water supply has gone down. And so they've become very inefficient as hydroelectric sources. And so it's been possible to make an argument to take the dams down. But what happens when you take the dams down and the rivers run free? When the rivers run free, the water all along the way at the source and along the river is no longer as hot, no longer as warm. It is cooler by many degrees, sometimes upwards of 20 degrees cooler. And not only does that restore the ecosystem, it actually means that all along the way, less water is loosed to things like evaporation, lost, right, to things like evaporation. Less water becomes non-potable. Less water is essentially lost to not only the ecosystem, but for human habitation. And so everything about opening up a dam brings more possibility. Okay, I'm not even talking about cleaning up the water. You know, the forever chemicals, the pollution, all of those kinds of things that we now are paying the price for, right? We're really paying the price for. It's like it's useful to not play the game. Oh, well, if the regulation says that this water with this much pollution will mean that you can still drink it. Well, what does that mean in terms of downstream? And by downstream, I mean 10 years hence, what kind of conditions will people have? What kind of conditions will the fish have? That would mean that the ecosystem becomes less and less and less healthy. Okay, food, shelter, electricity, healthcare, and water. Very, very basic. Can we pay attention to those things? And pretty much in that order. Pretty much in that order. Friends, we'll be back to talk more story about these things that matter. Hello, folks. We're back with Naalehu and Ariel, who are going to help me dig a little deeper into this notion of, in this critical moment, when we both have more needs and systems are struggling, what should we really focusing on? What are the fundamentals? Thanks for coming back.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Norma. And, you know, you're really giving us a roadmap here, I think, for focusing on the basics, you know, food, shelter, healthcare, electricity, water. And how do you think about, like, what people who are just struggling day to day to, like, put food on the table or make rent, like, what can folks do to, you know, focus on those basics? I think this feeling is we are focusing on those basics by just trying to, like, eke through day to day, right?
That's right.
So
That's right.
What do we do to kind of, like, maybe turn toward each other a little bit more and focus on them together?
Well, I think that one of the biggest opportunities we have is actually in the area of food, okay? Which is to say that although, you know, upwards of 25%, right, of the population is going to need food assistance, we have food in this country that can be distributed. And so the aspect about redistribution of food in this country is very dependent on volunteerism. Right? As long as you're not talking about like a government program. Okay? And if we're saying that for various reasons, SNAP, which is one of the most efficient ways of helping to support food redistribution, because a person has a card and they go to a grocery store or a farmer's market, right? And they basically buy that food, which means that everybody along the chain of the food gets paid, right? And so it's like food assistance is also farmers' assistance, is also economic assistance, you know, all those things. But so you can go and advocate, right, for SNAP, but you could also be part of the gigantic volunteer chain that will be necessary to be able to get food to where it's needed and not require people have to seek out their own food. It's like the mobility of food now is like extraordinarily important. So that's one example.
I mean, we saw that during COVID, right? Where
Yes.
we would renegotiate the pathways for how food moved from farmers into people's hands.
Absolutely.
And I think, you know, those are opportunities that can show that, you know, there is robustness, whether you're in Hawaii or California or other states that are producing food. I think there's also like a piece of the puzzle here that says like, well, we can sustain that for some amount of time without intervention of some way, right? Like
Right.
during COVID, we saw that those food chains upended. Why? Because we weren't seeing 30,000 visitors coming a day. And
That's
so
right.
we had to redistribute the food in a different way to get to different people. And so I think this is also just about the way at which we move resources and the cost of those resources as we talk through what actually happens with them. I think like the energy conversation is really interesting. It's like there's a huge paradox, right? The turn back towards burning of oil, maybe a short-term solution, but certainly there are other countries that are making headway with respect to renewables that will change the cost per kilowatt hour for them into the future, and will also decouple them from the cost of burning oil faster than the
Yes.
rest of us. You know, Hawaii
Right.
is certainly within in that realm where we're one of the last states that's burning as much oil as we are per capita, and not having moved towards a more robust renewable portfolio.
And I think that actually, like in the case of Hawaii, although this is not just for Hawaii audiences,
Yeah.
right? We're a case study, I believe, in like how large of a system is it useful to serve the number of people that you have, and that it's like we're moving now into a period of time in which when you essentially say, well, you know, Oahu only has 1.2 million people, about that, and they would say, well, that's barely the size that you would need for one grid. Yes, if you're looking at a traditional way in which you look at an electrical system. But I think we're moving into a situation now and conditions, and also just the science and the engineering has developed to a point where smaller microgrids may now make more sense. Yeah. And when you go to smaller microgrids, then you can also look at less industrial size alternative energy, right? So
Yeah,
I think that makes sense.
You know, like Hawaii is an interesting set of cases because you have 6 independent grids, right? Each island is not connected to anything else. And so the neighbor islands are actually much closer to getting to 100% renewable than
That's right.
than Oahu, right? The challenge that you come across with microgrids is calling out what the purpose is of the microgrid, right? And if you're trying to drive price as far down as possible, then microgrids costs per capita per solar panel to administer them and to run them actually is pretty expensive. But if you're talking about like energy sovereignty, community by community, then there are a lot of communities who actually call for that, right? And I think part of this is like in your case statement about data centers, as well as in grid scale electricity, whether it's solar, wind, geothermal. You have communities that are not wanting to bear the burden for large scale anything that is going to go off and feed other communities. And so you see that in small communities saying, no, we want enough to feed our community, but we don't want the excess and the burden of that excess to go somewhere else.
Yes, and so there is that part where, it's like, I think that we went for 3 or 4 decades, right, where we essentially said what improvement looks like is to get bigger. And we're now in a situation where just the conditions mean that if you're bigger, then if you go out, you impact more people, right? And so like there are many reasons, many of them strategic reasons, not to go to single large systems anymore. But there's also the thing about, it's like you're talking about like, like communities that have data centers are catching most of the impact without getting most of the the benefits, right? And industrial anything kind of fits into that category. So interrupting that particular design paradigm, right, is part of the work that we have right now. Yeah. When we were in the Dakotas, Lehu, talk about like those are places that you literally, because of the conditions, both of the ground, but also of the climate, would mean that it's impossible to grow produce. You can grow bison, but you can't grow produce, right? And so the really growing produce inside makes more sense than growing it on the ground. But you can't grow produce inside unless you break the notion of how much electricity you're going to pay, right? In order to grow that produce. So having very localized alternative energy that essentially is, right? Like very localized, plugged into not a grid, but plugged into a little bit of a system that is associated with the growing houses and the refrigeration houses and, like all of that. And then doing it on a community basis so that it's not small units, right? Everybody with their own garden, right? So it's like that type of right sizing, but bringing it down to the community scale where that which you're developing and who you are benefiting is right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a helpful way to kind of link some of these different fundamentals, because I think one of the things that can be difficult to wrap our heads around is this question of scale, right? Because I think we've been so trained to think bigger, 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 and it's always kind of the sprawl of that, of industrializing systems. Yet what I hear you talking a little bit about is kind of how do you come into useful relationship with multiple layered aspects of different sizes, maybe, right? That there may be, in one case, household gardens, in other cases, maybe medium scale producers of, say, protein, right? That is very difficult to produce on a household level.
That's right.
Right? And there's absolutely no way that we can think of meeting our full nutritional needs household by household in our production, right?
That's right.
But maybe layering these together, is that part of the answer?
Yes, I believe that's the case. And the other part is like only in a very few places there we could say the exception is that small places and small communities could go completely off the grid. So what we're talking about is we're talking about piecing these things together, right? It's like, okay, so you go to Costco and you go and buy your things in bulk. Well, you're a community garden, have, 25 families that, right, contribute. And of the 25 families, well, let's say only 10 of them, if they grow something will grow. Well, those 10 families should be the ones that grow. And then the other 15 families would have other responsibilities, other duties. Distribution, maybe they're in distribution, or maybe they're the ones that, get told by the people who can actually grow things, well, okay, turn the water on now, right? And, right, they've basically become part of the labor of it. And labor in which you're going to see a direct result of your labor, right? You are going to be sharing in the success of that community enterprise. And then, there's always the auntie who makes the best jam. Right. And so, auntie gets to take the produce and teach, other people or maybe the young people in that community how to make the jam. And then it becomes an enterprise, right, of some kind that accrues to the community, not just to the individual. But I think more and more of those. And I think that part of the key now is not to think of these as small exceptions or the Band-Aid that we will engage in until this too shall pass, right? Like it's a different thing to say, okay, we can redistribute produce and food during the pandemic. And so we're going to do all of these things on an emergency basis. And another thing to say, well, might this be the beginning of another way that is occurring on a robust and flourishing basis, right, within our communities? So
I think, the hard part here is that, like you mentioned in the last segment about just like how stretched some of these families are. And so like if you're going to go work in the community garden, then there's an assumption that you're not working 2 jobs already and that 50% of the income of everyone in the household isn't going towards, rent or covering the mortgage, because that starts to limit the possibilities of what people can do.
Yes.
I think, one of the pieces here is that like when you have increasing food costs tied to energy, you have increasing energy costs, you have increasing gas costs, people who were already at the edge get pushed over the edge. And some of those challenges are irreversible. The example would be like the outflux of folks that we see in Hawaii leaving, right? We get 9 or 10 or 11,000 people leaving every year, right? Almost 1,000 a month. And they're not likely to come back. Like once you give up, you have a real hard time making your way back. And so there are then these triggers that say, okay, well, this is basically irreversible. And I think that's one of the things that we need to really be careful about how it is that we solve for and balance for. It's like we do not have unlimited amounts of time to solve for some of these things.
We don't have unlimited amounts of time, including that, it's like we working 2 or 3 jobs, okay, is what people might need to do to get by. That's long been the case in Hawaii, by the way. And now when I hear like people talk about that on the news on the continent as being like a shockingly astonishing thing. And I think, well, we actually have experience, right, with that. We have experience, okay? But here's the deal, right? The entire economy of the country is going to go through radical shifts. And in the radical shifts of the entire economy, okay, you may have 2 or 3 jobs, but most of them are going to be part-time. And the aspect about your time, it's like a good amount of ways in which like the economy of the country could be humming along and we could all be partially unemployed. Okay? It's right? So we're in that. If we're all partially unemployed, how should we employ ourselves in service of ourselves? Understanding that the larger industrial entities are really looking at how to make a go of it without as many humans. Okay? All right? Okay?
Yeah.
Right? And so like there's this way in which this big shifts occur. I would say many thousands of experiments are useful before we get to the point where we essentially are forced into something, right? Forced into something. The other part is there are many ways to redistribute food. We don't only have to grow the food, right? We actually have lots of food that is already available in this country that is just about redistribution. It's just about that. But does mean that volunteer types of operations or operations that make sense that are not volunteer, but are like in like a different kind of gig economy, right? That going on. I had this conversation in Detroit where they have like food deserts, right? Okay. And the problem is like, how do you economically make sense of having businesses try to set up, brick and mortar, right, in a more distributed way in places where people basically might actually have, they buy things, but their purchase power is not, extensive, right? You know what I mean? How do you do that? And so one of the things I I mentioned is that back in the day, we used to have we called it the Yes I Man. We have those little food trucks, okay?
Yeah.
But rather than having like prepared food in those trucks, there were panel trucks, and they would stop and they put up the panel, and there would be shelves, and you'd have like little very neat bags of like produce and some eggs, and then in the refrigerator drawer a little bit meat and all that kind of things. On the other side you have like laundry detergent, right? Bars of soap, shampoo, right? And they just have a few things, and they would go neighborhood to neighborhood. And they would be there like on Tuesday and Friday, or like whatever the days of the week would be. And eventually that gave way to everybody going to the store. So in some of those places where there are food deserts, it may make more sense to have little portable food trucks, just as it may make sense to have portable libraries, right? Portable healthcare that doesn't require people to go to the clinics, right? But have people actually in the street itself, right? Going from place to place, right? Of course, because of the cost of fuel, these mobile hubs are going to need to have like panels on top of the truck in order to offset the fuel costs. But even with the fuel costs, more efficient, less expensive than some of these other larger scale kinds of solutions.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to throw out these examples of things that are already happening on this scale, because maybe it'll spark somebody listening and say, you know what, I might be able to start that where I live. And a couple other examples that come to mind for me, where I live in upstate New York, is an activist during COVID actually started something called Free Food Fridge, and just found ways to work with businesses and nonprofits, mostly independently owned, and said, can I put a fridge outside your business and plug it in, and then I'll get donations, and I put food in it for free, and people just come and get it. And there's fridges all over the city. And then another example is in schools. They've started to create little free and low-cost grocery stores. They just renovated our high school, and they put in a whole mini grocery store in the high school, and so people can just take what they need. And I think these are examples of things that are happening. And I think one of the ingredients that you've kind of named, but I want to kind of tease out a little bit more, is when we are talking about paying attention to the basics. The thread of all of this is community, right?
That's right.
And so what do we need to do in terms of paying attention to that?
Well, in this particular country, there is a strong value on individualism, and more so than in many countries in the world. In fact, we've been a very good exporter of the notion of individualism, individual rights, individual wealth, individual success. We've exported that idea to other countries. Well, we're now in a moment where it would be a good idea to take a new look at that. This has not been a country that has always been that. So if you want to look at whether or not we have the cellular memory for something else, we do. We definitely do. And this notion of becoming more in relationship to each other. Now, some people have been experimenting more, for example, understanding that because of the housing situation, and also because if you intend to age in place, right? That you may need to formulate like found community, right? Okay, found community that would be your found families, that you would pool your resources, right, rather than each one trying to make it on their own. And when you do that, you will undoubtedly be able to live better with each other than you would by yourself. This is even if you're only talking about the money side of the equation. But in community, I would say any storm is easier to weather. So the current storm that we're in, which will be a long one, it'll be a long transition, much easier to weather when you are with people and you're solving problems together with people. Friends, we've gotten basically to the end of this time together, but I know that there are threads of this that we essentially just need to carry over into other episodes, right? It's like what should we focus on, and how should we go about that, and what are the near-term opportunities that might arise from that. So thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we'll be right back.
Okay.
Well, friends, in this particular episode, we've been exploring in collapse, what should we be focusing on? What should we be paying attention to? What is it that people are going to need, but also that we as people could step in? If we can step in both on a collective basis outside of the system, but also if we're inclined to actually advocate within the system, then what should we focus on? Food and water and shelter and electricity and healthcare. Really the fundamentals. All of this will matter. And it matters that we do it as community. We will always be greater than I. And in caring for each other, we will actually discover what it is to be at the new scale of caring for people and caring for humanity. So I think that the opportunities are vast, but we'll talk more about that in the next episode. So I hope you join us in the Horizon Story. Thank you so much. The Horizon Story podcast is produced by Bryson Ho and Sarah Demarest de Rivera. Hosted and written by me, Norma Wong. Executive producer, Naalehu Anthony. Featuring Ariel Jacobson. For Collective Acceleration, Kelly Miller. For OEV TV, Ken Sato, Wesley Kealoha, Courtney Leong, Jeff Lee, and Ivy Lagadlagad. For Pa'akai Communications, Jamila Silver, Diana Han, Pearl Tule, Christine Matsuda. Hair and Makeup by Melody Levy. Mahalo to Kalihi, the land of my birth, ancestors, teachers, collaborators, and friends. Rosie Abraham for the support, and Scott Nine and Taj James for the encouragement. The Horizon Story is brought to you by OEV TV. Copyright by Collective Acceleration. Follow us on social at The Horizon Story. Questions to hello@thehorizonstory.com. Visit us where you find your favorite podcast or at thehorizonstory.com.